All right, tonight we are going to the next Jesus is better, and it's Jesus is a better priest. So I got a question for you. When someone says the word priest, what do you think of? Wow, Catholic, okay. Father? Black robes and collars. Anything else? Church, okay. Me? Oh, okay. I didn't sound very excited there. Sorry. Anyone else? What comes to mind? Is there any other image? Any other thought? Okay, yeah, sure. And okay, so next question. Why does that image, would you guys agree that's kind of the image that we all, and I'll totally confess to me too. So when I hear that, when I hear priest, that's what I think of. And I'd like to undo that, but I can't. Okay. So tonight Jesus is a better priest. And when we think of the word priest, we think of someone with a collar and a robe. But that's not what the Bible's talking about in the book of Hebrews specifically that we're in, when it's talking about Jesus being a better priest. And so we have to undo a little bit of how we think about priests. And so in the Bible, and specifically I'm thinking of 1 Peter. In 1 Peter, Peter writes to the church, and he says that the church, the people who follow Jesus, that they are a nation, a holy nation of royal priests. And he says that if you have become a believer, so that you now believe in Jesus, that you are now a priest. And so what we need to do before we start this talk is we need to undo what we think a priest is. Okay? And so when I say priest, and you think of someone in a robe or like a cap or a collar, then undo that, go like, oh, no, that's not what we're talking about. If you're a follower of Jesus, you are a priest. I wanted to start this talk this way because when we talk about Jesus being our high priest, I want you to start thinking about that, going like, oh, hold on a second. Because one of the main roles of a priest in the Old Testament was to represent other people before God. And that is actually one of the callings, I guess you could call it. When you become a believer, one of the calls that you have as a believer is to actually fulfill that role, that you can represent others before God. You don't have to be a pastor, you don't have to have a paid role, you don't have to have a collar, you don't have to have a robe. You can have a pink shirt on Pink Shirt Day and fulfill that role. Okay? So are you guys with me now? Okay, so that's how we're going to frame today's talk. So that's the pre-talk to the talk. Now we're going to talk about Jesus is a better priest. Now let's start with where we've been in Hebrews. So far, just a little reminder. So the writer of Hebrews has begun this letter with a very clear message that Jesus is better. And for most of the rest of the letter, he's going to tell us how Jesus is better and why he's better. And in each case, that's kind of what we've done. We've unpacked Jesus is better. So we start off with Jesus is better than the angels. And so heavenly beings. And the reason we did that is because it's believed, and it's written in the New Testament, that the Old Testament, or the Torah, the first 5 books of the Bible, was given to Moses on the mountain, or delivered to Moses by angels. And so it's like, oh, angels. So we found out that Jesus is better than the angels because Jesus is God's son. Ultimately, the writer of Hebrews makes it very clear that Jesus is God. And so Jesus is a better messenger because he is God's son. And he has a better message, which is the gospel. Secondly, we did Jesus is better than Moses Moses was God's faithful servant. So this is just kind of a breakdown of the comparison, really narrowed down just for us. Moses was God's faithful servant, but Jesus is God's faithful son. And so, of course, the son is better or greater than a servant in a household, right? So you're thinking of a family and their servants and a household. Well, of course, the son would be considered greater. And so that's the comparison we have between Moses and Jesus. And then last week we talked about Jesus having a better promise. And so talked about entering God's rest, which is really interesting. We unpacked that a little bit. Hopefully you understand that a little bit better. If you weren't here last week, then you can actually go to our YouTube channel and watch that and kind of figure out what is this promise, what is this rest that's promised. I think it's really cool. It's really interesting. And the comparison is Israel. In the story, he's referring to Israel wandering in the desert. The reason they had to wander in the desert is because they disobeyed God. Not just disobeyed him, but rebelled against him. They didn't want to hear from him. They hardened their hearts and wanted to do their own thing. And so God said, you can't enter the promised land, which the biblical writers described as a land flowing with milk and honey. If you remember, it's like, wow, that sounds good. Well, Jesus promises something even greater. So that was physical land that Israel was promised. The one generation of Israel that rebelled against God didn't get to go in and see the promised land. The next generation did. But Jesus promises something even greater. It's a new creation. And so the writer in that, from last week, what we talked about in Hebrews chapter 4, was comparing the physical promised land and Jesus' promise of a new creation. So anyway, it was obviously better. Okay, so that's where we've been. Today, Jesus is a better priest. Specifically, our text is telling us that Jesus is a better high priest. All right, and so we're going to be in chapter 5 for most of the time here. And I'm missing one of my... Oh no, it's printed on both sides. Okay. This is crazy. I'm pretty sure obviously I didn't. Unchecked that. Okay. Chapter 5, here we go. So if you got your Bible, you can follow along. Otherwise, it'll be on the screen here. Last week, we ended on a statement on high priest. And so he is continuing on in chapter 5 here. Every priest is a man chosen to represent other people in their dealings with God. All right, he's talking about Old Testament priests, okay? Remember our little spiel at the start? So if you're thinking of someone with a collar and a robe, or some kind of cap or whatever it is, let's back up. All right, so this is the Old Testament priests. Every high priest is a man chosen to represent other people in their dealings with God. He presents their gifts to God and offers sacrifices for their sins. So you can see it's a very important role. And he is able to deal gently with ignorant meaning they don't know better, and wayward, meaning they're rebellious, they do know better, people, because he himself is subject to the same weaknesses. Right? He's just a regular dude. Just happens to have this role. This is why he must offer sacrifices for his own sins as well as theirs. And so in the Old Testament, you had the high priest who would go once a year into this room called the Holy of Holies, where the Ark of the Covenant was, and it was a very special room, and the high priest was only allowed to go in there once a year. And he would, I've read this in the commentaries, and so I'm not saying that I know this for sure, but I've read that they would put a rope around his ankle in case he displeased God in some way, because this was the very presence of God. It's called the Holy of Holies. And so if there was something, and he didn't make it out, they could pull him out. Okay, so I think that's true. I don't know. I read it in a commentary a really long time ago, and I don't even remember which one it is. And so I'm like, but that's like, yeah, I guess that would make sense, because if you're entering the presence of God, like this is God's, like physical or manifest presence on the earth, was in the Holy of Holies in the temple in Jerusalem or in the tabernacle. And so it was kind of a scary thing. All right, let's keep going. And no one can become high priest simply because he wants such an honor. He must be called by God for this work, just as Aaron was. So if you've heard of Moses, Aaron was Moses' brother. And it was actually through Aaron was given the role of high priest. That is why Christ did not honor himself, by assuming he could become the high priest. So Jesus didn't make himself high priest. No. He was chosen by God, who said to him, "You are my son. Today I have become your father." And in another passage, God said to him, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Okay, so we're going to stop here. And I actually went further than I intended. So, what is the role of the high priest? Okay, so ultimately, a priest or high priest is chosen to represent other people before God. So the first thing we need to know about a high priest is they're chosen. Okay, this person is not someone who just really aspires to it and wants to be a priest. You just can't just be a priest because you want to. And so God actually gave one of the 12 tribes of Israel the priesthood, and that was the tribe of Levi. And you had to be a Levite in order to be a priest. And you had to be chosen specifically to be high priest. You had another level of choosing that you had to be chosen. And so that's why the writer is going like, Jesus just didn't, just go like, hey, I'm choosing myself because I'm better, right? No, that's not Jesus at all. But he was chosen by God, and we're going to find out why in a few minutes. So first of all, chosen. Secondly, he had to represent others in their dealings with God. So that means he's a mediator or a go-between, right? And so in order for the people to have any kind of dealing with God, they had to go through a priest. This is in the Old Testament. Thirdly, one of the roles of the priest was to offer sacrifices and gifts. And so, again, it was on behalf of others. If you had a gift for God, you would go through a priest. That's how God set it up. You needed a go-between. If you had a sacrifice, if you needed to sacrifice, and there was all sorts of sacrifices that the Jews had to do, you would have to do that through the priests. And so the high priest himself would offer sacrifices to God for the sins of the entire nation. And so that's where we get the idea of the Lamb of God, or a lamb without blemish, spotless, perfect lamb that would be killed because of the sins of the people. And so we're going to find out actually next week what God thought about that, even though he set it up. And so that was one of the roles of the high priest. Finally, another role was to offer prayers for and on behalf of the people. So he would pray for the people, but he would also, if you had a prayer or petition, you would go to a priest and offer that prayer. And it's not that you couldn't pray to God yourself, but if you had a request of God. And so one of the examples I'm thinking of is there was a woman named Hannah in the Old Testament, and she was having a rough go. And so she went to the temple or to the tabernacle to pray. And as she was praying, the high priest, Eli, came out. And she told him what was going on, and he told her that God would actually give her a son. She was asking for a son. And so it was through the priest, so you got the message from the priest that, hey, God's going to give you a son. So, kind of cool. Okay, so before I get to the next part of the text, I just want to talk about this really quick. I introduced this idea that we're a nation of priests, that God's desire for his people is to be a nation of priests. So all these things that we're talking about, the role of a high priest is also the role of a priest. And so when the New Testament says that when you become a believer, you become a priest, this is what it means. You have been chosen. You've been chosen by God. He calls, again in 1 Peter, a chosen people. So in order to be a priest, you have to be chosen. You can't just decide, I'm going to be a priest. No, God chose you. You can represent others in their dealings with God. You can be a go-between for people. You can offer sacrifices and gifts on behalf of others. So that's a little different. We're not doing like physical sacrificing of animals. But there's other types of sacrifices and gifts that we can do on behalf of people. And third, you can offer prayers. So this is, I'm not going to spend a lot of time here, but this is one of the things that struck me on this. When one of your friends is having a hard time, and you're like, can I pray for you? Do you realize that that's the role of the priest, that you're actually doing it, and that's what God wants you to do? When you pray for other people? And sometimes people are offended, but it's really, really rare. And I've asked people from, all over the map as far as where they are with God, if I can pray for them. And I've never had anybody get really, really angry with me at that. I've had people say, well, I guess prayer doesn't work because God's not real or whatever. But they always accept it. Isn't that interesting? I think that's so cool. But that's one of the roles of the priesthood. And as a believer, you've been given that role as a priest, that you can pray for others on their behalf. And so you can pray for them. It's cool. I just think it's awesome. What a nice, amazing thing that God, so this whole idea of making us a nation of priests. Okay, anyway, that's a sidebar. Let's keep going. All right, I just read this, and you probably heard the name Melchizedek, and so we're going to have a story, right? In another passage, God said to him, "You are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek." Interesting. Who is this Melchizedek guy? Well, we'll get to that in a minute. While Jesus was here on earth, he offered prayers and pleadings with a loud cry and tears to the one who could rescue him from death. And God heard his prayers because of his deep reverence for God. Now you're trying to think of what deep reverence is. The best way, I think the best translation actually of that is his submission. His submission to God. Because that's actually what the text is talking about. The people of Israel would not submit to God. And so in the previous text, God said, you can't enter my rest. You can't go into the promised land. And so in this one, we have Jesus, who is opposite to the example of Israel, because he does have submission, complete, deep submission to God. Even though Jesus was God's son, he learned obedience from the things he suffered. In this way, God qualified him as a perfect high priest, and he became the source of eternal salvation for all those who obey him. You guys catch that? The source of eternal salvation. And God designated him to be a high priest in the order of, here's this dude again, Melchizedek. All right, who's Melchizedek? Well, Melchizedek appears in the Old Testament during the time of Abraham. And so what was going on at the time is Abraham and Lot, is Abraham's nephew, they became so wealthy that they were like, we need to separate. We just too much livestock, right? It's not gold that they're fighting over. It's land to feed their animals. And so Abraham gives Lot first choice. And he says, you can pick, this part over here, which is the plains. It was more fertile and whatever. And so Lot says, oh yeah, I'm in. So Lot goes. He actually lived in Sodom. And and so they parted ways. Well, news came to Abraham one day that Lot and his family had been captured. And there was a bunch of kings got together and decided to do a bunch of raiding of these different cities. And so they had taken Lot. And so Abraham prayed, and God says, I'll give them into your hand. And so Abraham puts his men together, which I'm wondering, I'm like, I highly doubt they were trained soldiers, but I'm like, okay, whatever. This is most likely his servants. He puts an army together, whatever that looked like, I have no idea. But he goes and he actually conquers these, I think it was 5 kings, however many it was, these combined armies. Abraham defeats them. And so he's coming back and he's loaded with loot, right? And he's freed Lot and he's freed all of these other peoples that were involved in on the wrong end of the first war. And so as Abraham approaches the city of Salem, this mysterious king, Melchizedek, the king of Salem, comes out to meet him. And so what Melchizedek, the name Melchizedek means king of righteousness, and Salem means peace. And so you have Melchizedek is the king of righteousness and peace. All right. So Melchizedek goes out to meet Abraham, and because Abraham is returning from defeating these kings, and blesses him. And so it gives us this picture. 2 things happened here that make really obvious why Melchizedek is being chosen by God here, that Jesus would be in his line. Melchizedek blesses Abraham. Now, it is the greater who blesses the lesser, right? Secondly, Abraham gives him a tenth of all the loot that he's captured. And so a tenth is a very significant number in the Old Testament. And if you were a Jew listening to this, you'd be like, oh, that's like a tithe. It was a tithe. And so the lesser tithes to the greater, right? That's why if you believe in tithing and you tithe and give God money, you're the lesser giving to the greater, right? And so this is the picture that's given. And so in Hebrews chapter 7, which is just a couple chapters ahead, this is what it says. This is the whole mysterious guy. There is no record of his father or mother or any of his ancestors, no beginning or end of his life. So he remains a priest forever, resembling the Son of God. And so what's going on here is the writer of Hebrews is telling us that Melchizedek's actually a foreshadow of Jesus. And so when he says there's no beginning or end to his life or any record of his ancestors, he's just talking about genealogy. That there's no written record of this guy existing except in his dealings with Abraham. And obviously Abraham thought he was an amazing dude because he accepted the blessing and then gave him a tenth of everything. Like he didn't have to. He wasn't commissioned by Melchizedek. The last thing just to kind of think about is that one of the things that if you were a Jew reading this, you'd be thinking of the tithes. You'd also be thinking of the priestly role. So when God gave the promised land, when Israel finally entered the promised land, the next generation, God divvied it up into 12 different parts, or 11 or 12. But Levi didn't get any land. And God said that because Levi, your inheritance is me. God gave Levi himself because they were the priests. And so they would work in the temples or the tabernacle, whichever it was at the time, and they would fulfill the role of the priests. And so the rest of the nation was meant to give tithes. Part of the tithe would be to support their brothers, the tribe of Levi. And so this idea of support and priests giving a tenth to, again, into our text, that Abraham gave a tenth of everything that he had to Melchizedek. Here's the point. Melchizedek is better than Abraham. Right? This is what the writer's getting at. The greater. So Melchizedek is better than Abraham. And Abraham, because Abraham is would be the great-great-grandfather of Levi. And so they considered the father always to be the greater. And so Abraham is the father of the children of Israel. And so he would be the greatest. And so you have Levi on down the lines. So you have Melchizedek, Abraham, Levi. Therefore, Jesus is a priest in the order of Melchizedek, as a priest in the order of Melchizedek, is better than the priests in the order of Levi. So the whole point of him writing all of this out was to show that Jesus is better. He's a better high priest. This is the high priest you've known for hundreds and hundreds of years in the Old Testament system. Now we have a new high priest. All right, let's keep going. We're going to skip ahead a couple of chapters, and we're going to land in chapter 8 to end our talk here tonight. Here's the main point. We have a high priest who sat down in the place of honor beside the throne of the majestic God in heaven. That's an interesting way to phrase that. There he ministers in the heavenly tabernacle. Whoa, hold on here. We're going to talk about this actually next week. The heavenly tabernacle? The true place of worship that was built by the Lord and not by human hands. So the tabernacle on earth was built to very specific dimensions. In fact, if you've ever read the book of Leviticus, you probably got in maybe a few pages and went like, oh man, I don't know if I can do this. Because there's so many dimensions, so many things that everybody you got to know, and laws and all this stuff. But when you look at the, the tabernacle and the dimension of the temple, it had to be exact. And why is that? It's because it was a replica. So the tabernacle on earth was a replica of what was in heaven. And so it had to be the exact dimensions. Isn't that cool? Okay, so it wasn't built with you. That's what he's talking about, tabernacle in heaven. And since every high priest is required to offer gifts and sacrifices, our high priest, which is Jesus, must make an offering too. And that's actually where we're going to go for next week, the offering that he gave. We're going to jump ahead a couple more verses. But now, Jesus, our high priest, has been given a ministry that is far superior to the old priesthood. For he is the one who mediates, that's the go-between, for us a far better covenant with God, based on better promises. Okay. Jesus is better. Here's the comparison. We'll go through it quick, and then I'll answer the question, why does this matter? All right, Jesus is better. Jesus is priest in the line of Mel, if that's okay, using the short form. Israel is in the line of Levi, so Jesus is better. The other priests in the Old Covenant, they all die, right? Once they're dead, they're done. But Jesus, although he died once, is alive forever. Other priests were sinful, had to offer sacrifices for their own sin as well as the sin of the people, right? But Jesus was sinless, so he doesn't have to offer anything for himself. The other priests had to offer over and over and over. Like this was ongoing for hundreds of years. But Jesus, well, his offering was better because it's only once. He only had to offer once, and it's because he offered himself. And that's actually next week's talk. Jesus is a better sacrifice. So Jesus intercedes for his people at the right hand of the throne of God. That's pretty awesome. The priests of the Old Testament, other priests, had to carefully enter the Holy of Holies and only once a year. So we can see Jesus is better, right? Ultimately, Jesus has a better covenant than the previous covenant given to Moses because he is a better priest, has a better sacrifice, which we're going to talk about next week, and has better promises, which we talked about last week. All right, so you're like, okay, that's good. Jesus is better. Why does this matter? Well, I'm going to go back to where we left off last week, why this matters. This is how the writer of Hebrews started into this whole idea of high priest. So then, since we have a great high priest who has entered heaven, Jesus, the Son of God, let us hold firmly to what we believe. This high priest of ours understands our weaknesses, for he faced all of the same testings we do, yet he did not sin. That's pretty amazing. I got to say, it's very amazing. So, this is why it matters. So let us come boldly to the throne of our gracious God. There we will receive his mercy, and we will find grace to help us when we need it most. You see, you guys, we need a priest. We need a high priest. Someone who will intercede, someone who will mediate between us and God, and that's what Jesus has done for us. He's the go-between. He's the high priest. That's why this is so important. So the high priest of the Old Testament was just kind of a bit of a foreshadow of what was to come. That someday there would be, in the language of what we read today, a perfect high priest. And that he would be God himself, but he wouldn't just be God himself, that he would be fully human. Right? And so Jesus was fully human, fully God. And it says he's seated at the right hand of the throne of God, interceding for us, pleading for us on our behalf. That's the high priest that we have now. Just think of the old covenant, you guys. It's like, oh. Oh, yeah, that is way better. Because our relationship with God is completely dependent on Jesus mediating this new covenant, which we'll talk about next week. Because you're like, what? What covenant are we talking about? Come next week. We'll explain it. And we all know how much mercy that we need. Because none of us can earn our way to God. Like, we can't get to God. We just can't be good enough. We're flawed. We make mistakes. We're sinful. We need Jesus. And specifically in the role of a high priest to mediate on our behalf. Because he offered a sacrifice. The sacrifice was himself. And the Bible tells us, New Testament, that he prays for us. He prays for his people. Intercedes on our behalf. All of those priestly functions, Jesus is doing for you. That is why you can be in relationship with God. That's why you can actually approach God boldly, not because of you, but because Jesus is the high priest. That's why you can enter the throne room of God. That's why you can pray straight to God. That's why you can fulfill the priestly role for people who don't believe. Because Jesus is the high priest. That's where we'll find grace and mercy when we need it. So God sees all and knows all. We talked about that last week. Right? That everything is naked and exposed before him. Nothing is hidden. It's all in the open. God sees all and knows all. And no one will get away with anything because God is just. Right? And that's, sometimes we feel like that's a hard statement for ourselves until we think about all the terrible things that people have done around us and around the world, and we're like, oh yeah, that person needs, good thing. He's not getting away with it, or she's not getting away with it. Because God's just. And so we desperately need God's mercy and grace. We need a high priest, or we're doomed. So as high priest forever, this is gold, you guys. Jesus will always represent you before God. Isn't that cool? He will always plead your case before God. And best of all, he will always win. Because we belong to him. He's our high priest. We're God's children. If you're a follower of Jesus, you're part of God's family. So this is why we need a high priest. Jesus is better than any other plan that you might have to earn God's favor or his mercy or to somehow impress God, or when you stand, and later on the writer of Hebrews talks about this, that we'll stand before God at the judgment. And then what? I don't know about you, but I'm going to go, that guy over there, that's my high priest. Jesus, this is actually not going to happen, so by the way. Jesus is my high priest. He's offered sacrifices for me. He offered himself for me. He's prayed for me. He's pled my case. I'm really banking on that. Because I don't know what other plan you might have, but at some point this life ends for everybody. And it seems maybe like a really, really long ways away when you're young, but life goes really quickly. And pretty much everybody at the end of it goes, what happened to it? It's just zipped past. And so we need a plan. My plan is Jesus, because he's not just a better plan, he's the best plan. And so if you want to start a relationship with Jesus, you can do that tonight. If you have a relationship with Jesus, I'm hoping that you are encouraged by this whole idea that, not just idea, this reality that Jesus is your high priest and what he's done and is doing right now on your behalf.